All right, hello. In this video, we're going to introduce React and show you how to get set up and get started so that you're able to do some programming using the React framework. All right, so what is React? Well, React is a framework that's going to, well, library is really, that's going to let us be able to dynamically generate and interact with the DOM. Basically, it's a replacement for all the document.query selector and sort of all the DOM level manipulation we've done. It provides a simpler, a more sort of expressive way of being able to do that kind of manipulation, right? So React is going to let us create elements using JavaScript, put them on the screen, interact with them, change them, do the kind of JavaScript work we've done before, but doing it in sort of a more expressive, more isolated, sort of connected kind of way. Um, that's useful, sure. It makes it like a little bit nicer to code. React also is then going to let us be able to organize our DOM into what we call components, which are sort of think of user interface elements. So we're basically going to be able to think about designing and structuring our code around the parts of our page. So we might say, here's the code for the header, here's the code for the nav bar, here's the code for a table, a particular table. Here's the card for a form. We'll be able to build, not the card, sorry, the component for a form. We'll be able to build out those components that like makes it easier to do page design work, to think about things not in terms of divs and paragraphs, but think about things in terms of like nav bars and data tables and sort of more complex, more sort of semantic understanding of the code. Finally, React is able to do this in ways that make it very efficient from a computational perspective. Like it's very quick to run so that changes to the DOM show up really fast. The reason this happens is because React is built for larger scale systems. So if we actually go to React's website, we can go and see the details for what React structure is. They have a lot of tutorials and documentations on how this works. It's pretty good overall. So if you need to go through React's library, understanding how things works, not a bad place to go. If we scroll down past all the examples to the bottom of the page and we let it load, we can get to the footer. And as you may recall, in the footer for any document, it'll tell us who created it, right, where it came from. And we can see that React was created by Meta. React is the system that's built for to drive Facebook. So what that means then is that React is designed for the scale of Facebook style applications, right? The reason this framework exists is for scales that for applications for web systems that are at Facebook level complexity, where lots of things need to be happening at once. You need to be able to update lots of different chats and messages and posts and ads and all the various things you see on Facebook. We need to be able to have that happen really fast. So a lot of what we use React for in sort of industry and practice is at these larger scale applications. This is going to make it feel a little overkill for some of the projects and work that we're doing in this intro class because we're building projects that, while interesting and complex, are not Facebook level complex. So it's going to feel a little bit like we're using a sledgehammer for a very small nail. But the goal here is really to learn this as a library, as a process, because this is what's used in a large parts of the industry. And it's a good way of understanding how current modern web development works. Okay. So I need to note that React is created by Facebook, and Facebook is a horrible, horrible company, and has been for years. So there's this real question around the ethical, like whether it's actually ethical and appropriate for us to be using tools built by this other system, right? Facebook has a long history of doing things like violating the Fair Housing Act by letting you, for example, only advertise your houses to white people. Facebook has a massive sets of information leaks, right? They've been leaking data, people's data for years. I don't know if anyone can remember the Cambridge Analytica scandal from when they basically just like sold off everybody's data. They have been one of the major sources of misinformation across the years. Again, this is a little bit old. They've sort of been taken over by other social media platforms now. But they have been a sort of long history of promoting disinformation and basically sort of allowing people to say whatever they want. They are complicit in genocide, in many different kind of forms of genocide. Again, sort of supporting and allowing people to do that kind of coordination and actually promoting that through the various algorithmic structures that they use. The main line being is that Facebook and Meta in general have chosen profits over any kind of user safety or any kind of user protection. It is not a good company. It's not a very a good company. So you get that question of, okay, if this is a system built by Facebook and Facebook's not good, should we be using this and should we be using this kind of tool at all? Um, which is a fair question. Now, the people who built React, right, the software developers, the people who use it are fine. They're lovely people. They're just working for a horrible company, and that's like that's everybody. That's how that works. Um, the other reason that we then learn React is because while there are other web frameworks out there, right, React is not the only one that's used for um, I'm gonna get off the slide for a moment. React is not the only one that's used for doing this kind of work. It is the most popular. It is also the sort of the most foundational in a sense. So it is still used by the most people, right? If you were going to say, I'm going to go use sort of a large framework for building interactive web systems, React is kind of the default that you will go with. Everything else that's been built since then, all these other frameworks that come out are generally reactions to React. Like someone says, oh, I don't like what React does, or I don't like how React works. I'm going to make a version of React that's slightly different. So once you've learned React, you'll be best prepared to go learn whatever the new tool is that's going to come down and come around in the next year or two, or 3 or 5 or 10, because they're all going to be sort of starting from like kind of assumption of, well, everyone understands how React works, and this is why we're doing something better. So while React may not be the best tool, it may not be built by the best company, it may not be necessarily even the right tool for any job, it's a good tool for us to learn because it's going to provide a strong foundation for anything you want to do further. Um, so that's part of why we learn React in this class. Again, this is generally, it's worth noting whenever you use any kind of system to know who built it, why are they building it, what's that coming down. If we use React, is that causing other security issues? Is it causing other privacy concerns? Is it something we want to support if we want to support a particular group? And sometimes you want to say no. Um, and that kind of consideration, right, that kind of choice on what library or what programming library you want to use is something that you should keep in mind as you sort of move forward with your careers. You're using React for this class because that's what we're teaching, and that's how, again, that's the best tool for learning the foundations of interactive web development, but that's the place that we're going to go. Okay, so that's what React is. That's the overall structure, right? Again, it's a tool for, as I just said, slides, it's for, I'm going to let us manipulate the DOM and let's just sort of do this in kind of easy, concrete ways. Now, the biggest challenge with setting up React is that React is going to use a language, a programming language, it's a variant of JavaScript, called JSX, and we'll talk about that in the next video, so we're not going to talk about that right this second. But the language that React uses isn't actually valid JavaScript. So we're going to write JavaScript that the browser can't interpret. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to translate this sort of React JavaScript into sort of real normal JavaScript that the browser can interpret and make that thing and make all our code work. This process is called transpiling. It's similar to compiling, right? You've probably, if you've done Java or any other language or C language, you've compiled your code. Compiling is taking human readable code and converting it to machine readable code. Transpiling is taking human readable code and converting it to another human readable code. We're converting from JSX into pure JavaScript. So there's a whole bunch of tools that will do this work. There's lots of different sort of frameworks and scaffoldings and ways of doing sort of building React applications and doing this transpiling work. We're going to be using one of the more popular tools called Vite. It is not the biggest tool, but it's in many ways the smallest, it's the most lightweight. It's the one that's going to sort of let us do just React stuff without having to add a whole bunch of other pieces around with it. Right? It's going to let us get most close to sort of the core understanding of what's going on with this React system. So we're going to use this tool called Vite in order to make sure that we can build out our React applications. So how does that work? There's our slide. Where's the code? Cool. So in React applications, we're going to end up having a whole bunch of different dependencies that are going to basically be the libraries we'll use to do this kind of translation work. So in most React applications, so these are going to be anything that you're given that's for you in terms of your problem sets, your homeworks, and then you will build one of these for your projects. But once you've got sort of your React application sort of started and initialized, what you'll end up doing is having a set of dependencies that include Vite as the program we want to run. There's a number of other sort of like testing dependencies and then React dependencies as well, but these are going to be sets of tools we're going to want to use. So for one of these projects, because we want to use this Vite tool as a dependency, we're going to need to make sure we install it through npm. So we're going to do what we've normally done, where we're going to go into our project folder and we're going to run npm install in order to be able to install the dependencies, so install this Vite library, this Vite package. It's not a global application. We're doing this once per project. Cool. Once we have that in place, we're then able to run what we call the Vite development server. So what we're going to do is we're going to run this program, this Vite program, which is basically going to set up its own initial live server. So this is going to be similar to the live server we talked about in previously in the class, but it's going to be replacing that process, right? It's going to build its own web server that does that transpiling work so that when we go to view a page, Vite is transpiling our React code into code that the browser can understand, showing it on the page. It'll manage all of our module level work, all of our imports and exports, and making sure we can do all that those pieces, including external libraries. It lets us be able to see sort of syntax errors nicely in the console. It basically creates us a nice sort of working environment that we can do. So the way that we're going to do that is, again, we're going to make sure we're in our project directory. So we're going to want to make sure you cd into that directory. You can't just run Vite from anywhere on your computer. You have to be in the project directory because Vite is per project. We've installed our dependencies. We made sure that we installed Vite and everything's up and ready to go. And then we're going to use the command npm run dev. What that's going to do is it's going to go to our package file and it's going to run the dev script, which you can see is basically running Vite. There's a couple other scripts as well. We won't worry about those in a moment. Um, so npm run dev will start your development server. If you're on some Windows machines, because of how Windows has configured like access to ports and access to various content, you might need to add these extra two arguments, two dashes sort of next to each other as one argument, which is basically saying stop ignoring all the other like special Vite arguments, and then the dash dash host argument, which basically saying please allow me to treat this as a hosted website that I can be able to access. So because I'm on a Mac, I don't need to do that. So I'm just going to go ahead and run npm run dev. So when I do that, it'll start up the Vite server very quickly, right, ready to have less than a second. And it's basically going to give us a URL, right? It'll give us a local URL similar to what Live Server did that said, this is where I can go view my running React application. This is where the host argument thing comes from for the network stuff. So I can take that URL, I can put it into my browser, and then it'll take a second to load initially as it sort of finishes doing its initial transpiling, and it'll be able to load out my content, right? There's my hello world content from my React application, right? That's kind of the first thing I've got set up. So that's how we sort of get our web server up and running. Now, importantly, you have to run the Vite dev server in order to do any kind of React work, right? In order to see any of your code. You can't just open an HTML file because, again, all the JavaScript code, everything we're going to be building, doesn't work in the browser. It has to be transpiled. It has to run through this dev server. So the way that we structure it, the way we get started doing any kind of React programming is we make sure we've got Vite installed. And again, this will be pre-set up for all your problem sets, for all the exercises you need to do. Install your dependencies, run your development server, and that'll be up to go, running good. This will take up your terminal. You can hit Control C in order to sort of close it to stop it. You can also, if you want to go do Git stuff or other command line work, just open up a separate terminal is usually a good practice. So you can sort of have your Vite terminal running in one place and your other terminal command line work working somewhere else. Okay. With that, so that's the way of how we sort of get started and get a React app running effectively. Let's take a couple minutes and just look through what the code for all of this looks like, and just how it's set up. So in a React application, a Vite level application, you'll notice we have an index.html file, just like we do normally. In the index.html file, there is almost no content. So the index.html file has literally two elements inside the body. It has a root div, which is where all of our content is going to end up showing up. And then it has a script that loads this main.jsx file. And that's it. That's all that goes into the HTML file. In React, all of the content for our page, everything from the header to the nav bar to the mains to the footers, all the content is going to be generated through JavaScript, right? It's all going to be created and rendered as content through JavaScript, and then the React system inserts it and pens it into the main page. So we never write any HTML in the HTML file. We write all of our HTML, all of that content is going to be built through JavaScript. So all we're going to get here is our root div, which is basically where React is going to put stuff, and then our script file that says, please run React, right? You are the piece that we're going to work. The only thing you'll ever do in this file is if you want to change your title, if you want to adjust your metadata, like anything that happens in the head, you'll do that through this file. But basically, once you've set up your title and your favicon, you've sort of got all those pieces in place, you close this file, forget about it, and never open it again. You just like never ever look at the HTML file. All of our then content, all the sort of work we're going to end up doing ends up going inside of this source folder. So SRC stands for the source folder. And you'll see inside that we have a main.jsx file. This is similar to an index.js file. Vite, as a convention, calls it main as opposed to index because it's the main starting point. And the .jsx extension indicates it is using this JSX, this React JavaScript syntax. Technically, you can call it .js files and things will still kind of work, but call it JSX makes Vite. You have to do less configuration for Vite to make everything work. Um, in our main.jsx file, this is a really basic version. You can see that what we're doing is we're able to do things like import from other libraries. So we'll import React from the React library. Note that because this is a local, or we're importing from a library, right? We're importing from some stuff that was installed as a dependency, so it's inside of my node modules folder. We don't put a // in front of it. We don't put .js at the end. We're not importing a specific module file. We're importing a library as a whole. So we're going to import the React library from React. We'll import React DOM from React DOM. These things will get used in moments where I was saying to do that. The other thing that we do in React is we actually import all of our JavaScript. We don't include this through links in the HTML. What we do is we import them as files. That as effectively almost as source code. And what that does, that lets Vite kind of bundle it up and compile it and compress it and build it all together into our whole application. So while it's possible to use a linked element in the HTML, it's better practice to just build everything all together and get all of our CSS kind of in one place. So we'll tend to then import the CSS file to make sure that that's getting loaded on our page when our main.jsx file runs, and then we can do some work. We then have sort of our React work about actually getting React up and running, and we'll talk about how that works more in later videos. We actually talk about how JSX works and how all those pieces come together. Cool. Once we've got this in place, right, we've got React up and running. I'll note that, again, you can open up your developer console. You'll be able to see any errors that might show up for React will show up in the developer console. So just like with JavaScript, you'll want to have that open. Currently, it's prompting me to install the dev tools. They're not required, but you can use them. Who cares? You can also, of course, look at your elements. You can see our content, right? So you can see that in my div, right, in my root, this H1 element got added in, right? That wasn't part of my HTML. That was added in by the React framework. So that's how that system works. And of course, because this is running like a live server, similar to what we were using with live server, if we modify my content, right, if I add some extra exclamation points and I save my file, my web page will automatically refresh, it automatically reloads and says, hey, look, now we've got different content in there. We're able to see how that works. So again, we'll talk about how this content works in more details later, but we'll in a later video. But for now, really, I want to make sure you're thinking about here's where all my content, like here's the overall structure of my page. The code we're going to write is all going to be inside of .jsx files, and all that's going to be inside of my src, my source folder. The one last thing I want to note is we do have a public folder that I've initialized for this example. The public folder is where you're going to put things like images or media assets, anything that's not source code, but you want to be part of your application. So you'll notice that I, for example, have a puppy picture here that's inside of an image folder that's inside the public folder. You can't quite, the VS Code is highlighting that in a little bit different way. So anytime you want to include an image of some kind, right? You want to have images in your page and you want to have a bunch of image files, put them into that public folder. And then what you'll do is in your HTML and that you'll build through your JavaScript, you'll reference those images relative to that public folder. So for example, if I want to include an image, and I'm going to go ahead and we'll ignore, I'm going to write my HTML in here. Well, again, we'll talk about how this works later. If I want to include my image element here, then the source for that image is going to be image/puppy.jpg, because again, it's inside the public folder. So I'm not referencing it relative to this file, which would say go up into public, then go down to public. All your images is going to be referenced from public as like, that's like the root directory from the HTML from the browser's perspective. Which can get things a little bit confusing, but roughly just think, put stuff into the public folder and then pretend that that's like your home and all your image paths will be relative to that. And that's how you then be able to see those kind of things come together. And I can go and show you, right, that my puppy then shows up if I do that kind of work. Okay. So that's the overall Git structure. We again, we're gonna do all our JavaScript. We're going things to make sure, right, you're running your dev server so you can actually view your content. If you just double click on the HTML file, it won't run anything because it's running as a module, and the module won't do any work, won't understand any of the code that's getting run inside of it anyway. Put your code in all of your code, your CSS and your JavaScript inside of the source folder, the src folder, and any images and stuff can go inside of public. Cool. And with that, you should be mostly set up to actually get started building a React application, actually do some React coding. In the next video, we'll be able to talk more about how to actually write the code that React uses to make this kind of stuff appear.